Hello everyone, and welcome back to Sleepy Scares. I know many of you tune in to unwind and drift off into a peaceful sleep, so before you settle in, I'd love for you to drop a comment, letting me know where in the world you're listening from. If you're enjoying the episodes, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Now, let's get cozy, relax, and dive right in. Story 1. The old house had been empty for years. Everyone in town knew it. The place out on Blackwood Road. The one with the overgrown yard that swallowed the bottom of the porch. I'd driven past it 100 times, always catching it in the corner of my eye, the sun reflecting off the dusty windows in a way that made them look like vacant eyes. It always seemed like it was watching me, even when I wasn't looking at it. I don't know why I decided to go in. Just a stupid idea on a Tuesday. The kind you get when you're bored, and the sky is that dull gray that makes everything feel a bit off. I parked my truck a little ways down the road, not wanting to draw attention, and walked back, the gravel crunching under my boots. The air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me. The gate, what was left of it, was rusted and hanging open, groaning softly as I pushed it aside. The yard was a mess, weeds thick and tangled, climbing over everything. I picked my way through, my foot catching on vines that felt strangely cold, even in the late summer heat. Stepping onto the porch, I could feel the wood give a little under my weight, a soft, protesting moan. The front door was warped and swollen, but it wasn't locked. I pushed it open, the hinges screaming like something was being tortured. The smell hit me first, a musty, damp odor mixed with the lingering ghost of something I couldn't name. The air inside was still and heavy, almost solid, like stepping into another world. Sunlight filtered weakly through the grimy windows, casting long, distorted shadows. The living room was bare, just dust and decay. Old newspapers scattered like fallen leaves. I walked slowly, my boots making soft thuds on the wooden floors. It was quieter in here than it should be, the silence pressing in, almost suffocating. I wandered into what must have been the kitchen. Empty cabinets hung open, their doors creaking gently. A single chipped plate lay on the counter, coated in a thick layer of dust. I touched it cautiously, the porcelain cool and smooth under my fingertip. It felt wrong to be handling something that had been untouched for so long. Upstairs, the stairs creaked alarmingly with each step. The air grew colder the higher I went, a noticeable shift that made the hair on my arms stand up. The upstairs hallway was long and narrow, doors lining each side like dark eyes staring back at me. I didn't want to open any of them, but I couldn't explain why. Just this feeling, deep in my chest, that I shouldn't. I forced myself to open one, the handle cold and slick under my hand. Inside, it was a bedroom. An old bed frame stood in the center, mattress gone, just the wooden slats. A child's toy lay abandoned in the corner, a worn teddy bear with one button eye missing. It looked up at me with its sad, single eye. I had to look away, the image getting stuck in my head. I closed the door, feeling a sense of dread I couldn't shake. The house was starting to get to me. The silence was no longer peaceful, but oppressive, like something was holding its breath, waiting. I stepped into another room. This one smaller, maybe a study. Bookshelves lined the walls, their shelves mostly empty, but a few tomes remained, their pages yellowed and brittle. I touched the spine of one, the title barely visible through the dust. I pulled it out. The pages felt like tissue paper in my fingers. On one page there was a photo, someone I didn't recognize. A woman, her face blurred and indistinct, but with these wide eyes, they sent a shiver right through me. I put the book back, my heart starting to pound. I felt watched, like something was just behind me, breathing on my neck. I turned, but there was nothing, just the empty room, the dust motes swirling slowly in the faint light, and the unnerving feeling that I wasn't alone. I moved away from the bookshelves, my steps quickening, the floorboards groaning under my feet. I wanted to leave, to get out, but as I turned to go back into the hallway, I heard it. A soft, almost inaudible sound, like a whisper coming from down the hall. It was just a breathy sigh, a brief noise, but it made my blood run cold. I stood still, listening, my breath held in my chest. There it was again, a little louder this time, a soft, sighing sound, as if someone was very close. I couldn't see anyone. There was just the long, empty hall, and this sound coming from its end, or from one of the rooms. I couldn't tell. I started backing away, moving slowly, my eyes never leaving the dark space, my heart hammering in my chest, the rhythmic pounding loud in the suffocating silence. I bumped into something with my shoulder. It was the door, the same door I'd come through. I reached behind me and opened it, then backed out of the room, my eyes never leaving the hallway, the floorboards squeaking under me. I didn't want to turn around. I just wanted to get back downstairs, to get back outside. I went as fast as I dared on the creaking staircase, my hand gripping the railing tight. I could feel the eyes on me still, and the sighing sound, just a faint whisper, seemed to follow me, echoing in the house. I reached the bottom of the stairs and didn't stop. I just ran, my feet pounding on the worn wooden floor. I burst out the front door, not stopping. Not until I was out front, stumbling across the overgrown garden and onto the road. I didn't look back. I didn't lure. I ran until I reached my truck. I fumbled with the keys, got inside, and started the engine. I reversed out onto the road and drove away, the old house disappearing in my rearview mirror, its dark windows like vacant eyes, watching me go. I haven't been back. I don't think I ever will. But sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet, I still hear it. The whisper, the soft sigh, and I feel that same sense of dread. Like something is still watching, waiting, somewhere close by. I know the house is still there, out on Blackwood Road. I know it's waiting for me. Story 2. It started with the fog. We get fog here, in the valley, especially in the late fall. It's usually a pretty soft kind of fog, the kind that swirls around the trees and makes everything look a little magical. But this fog was different. It was thick, like you could almost feel it pressing in on you. A heavy gray blanket that seemed to swallow sound. It was a Tuesday, a normal Tuesday. I'd finished work. I'm a librarian at the Old Town Library, a job as quiet as the books I shelve. I was driving home, the familiar route through the winding back roads, the kind that haven't changed much in 100 years. The fog started rolling in as I passed the old Blackwood farm, the one that's been abandoned for, 30 years now. Even on a clear day, that place has a certain unease to it. The windows are just black holes, and the barn sags like it's about to collapse in on itself. The fog made it worse, like it was actively trying to hide something. I remember slowing down, even though I knew I should keep going. I could barely see the road in front of me, just the faint yellow lines disappearing into the gray. The headlights didn't seem to cut through the fog at all. They just created 2 weak pools of light that didn't do much good. I felt a chill creep up my spine, the kind you get when you feel like someone is watching you, even though there was no way anyone could be. The next few miles, I drove slower than usual. The usual familiar landmarks of my route became obscured by the thick fog. The old stone bridge was barely visible, and the only sound was the steady hum of the car engine and the occasional crunch of tires
on loose gravel. I felt the urge to roll up the window, even though the car was already pretty warm, just to create an additional barrier from the outside. By the time I reached the turnoff from my street, I was gripping the steering wheel a little too tightly. The houses were there, of course, but they looked different than usual. Each house was shrouded in its own fog, making them seem isolated, uninviting. It made me want to get inside, quickly. I pulled into my driveway, thankful to be home. The fog reached all the way up to my porch and seemed to linger around the edges of my house. It felt like a presence, like it was waiting. I hurried inside, locking the door behind me and throwing all of the deadbolts. I usually leave the porch light on, but tonight I didn't. I wanted to be completely in the dark, as if that would somehow make me safer. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Usually you can hear the fridge humming or the pipes gurgling. But there was nothing. Just a heavy, suffocating silence. I turned on all the lights, but it didn't help. The house felt cold. Not the kind of cold where you need to pull on a sweater. More like the kind of cold that seeps into your bones, the kind that makes you want to curl up and hide. I decided to make tea, something that's normally comforting, but even the sound of the kettle boiling was unnerving in that suffocating and eerily silent environment. I sat in the living room with the mug in my hand, staring out the window, watching the fog twist and writhe outside, like some huge invisible creature. It must have been around midnight when I noticed the window. Not just the fog outside the window, but the window itself. The glass seemed distorted. I got closer, and it looked like there were ripples on the surface of the glass, like someone had just touched it. But there was no one there. The house was locked up tighter than a drum. I touched the glass, and it was cold, unnaturally cold. I spent the rest of the night on the couch, too scared to go to bed. And I think it was at this point that I started to convince myself it's all in my head. The fog was messing with me. I'd had a long day. I was just tired, but the uneasy feeling never left. I kept scanning the room, turning my head and watching corners, convinced that something was about to appear from the shadows. The following morning, the fog was still there, just as thick as the night before. The sun was a pale, weak glow behind it, and everything seemed muted, drained of color. I noticed the neighbor's house across the street. They hadn't put out their trash that morning, even though it's always on the curb by now. It's a small thing, a mundane detail, but it bothered me, and I started to feel a sense of dread creeping in again. I went to work, the library feeling both safe and unsettling at the same time. The big old building had so many dark corners, so many places for secrets, and the fog hung around the windows like it was watching. Most of the day passed and there were no calls, no people, just me, alone, with the books and the shadows. It felt like a terrible and quiet isolation, especially when I had the memory of the fog from the night before. I couldn't shake them, the images of the house, the cold glass, the heavy silence. I tried to focus on my work, but mostly I would find myself staring out of the windows, focusing on the fog. The way it moved, the way it seemed to hide the world outside. I found myself searching for something in the fog, but I wasn't sure what. Something not there before. And I began to feel like I wasn't the only one looking through the fog. As the sun began to set, I decided to leave. And strangely, the fog seemed a little lighter, as though it was moving away, taking itself somewhere else. I got back in the car and took the familiar path home. As I passed the Blackwood farm, I couldn't see much through the fog, still, but I could tell the house was there. In the middle of the fog, a black hole in a gray space. When I got home, I noticed an envelope by the door. It wasn't there before. I picked it up. It wasn't addressed to me, just a name. I didn't recognize the name. It was scrawled onto the envelope in an untidy hand. I pushed it through the letterbox, knowing it was the right thing to do. Walking inside, I had the sense of being watched. Something was there. I knew it. I spent the whole night unable to sleep, the unease growing into an overwhelming sense of dread. Every noise the house made, every creak was interpreted as something else. The fog seemed to be closer than ever, pressing against the walls, watching from the windows. Like hearing things, sounds that weren't there before, like soft taps on the glass, or whispers just outside the door. The silence was no longer suffocating. It was replaced by an unnerving and dreadful anticipation. I didn't sleep that night. I just watched the fog and waited. And I had the worst feeling. The feeling that it was all unfolding just as it was supposed to. And I had no idea what was going to happen next. The fog was just a prelude. All the anxiety and discomfort had built up, and I felt like I was on the precipice of something awful. This wasn't just a bad dream or a trick of the mind. I knew that now. I knew it down to my bones. I didn't know what was coming, but I had the feeling that it would find me no matter where I went. Story 3. It started with the renovations. Not the glamorous kind you see on TV, but this old house is falling apart kind. My grandfather left me his place, a rambling Victorian in a forgotten town. The house was in rough shape, peeling paint, overgrown gardens, and a musty smell that clung to everything. I knew it would be a project, but I wasn't prepared for what I found. It was a Tuesday. I was pulling up old linoleum in the kitchen, the kind with faded floral patterns that looked both innocent and sinister. The setting sun cast distorted shadows through dusty windows. Beneath the floorboards, I found a small wooden box, dark and smooth, almost black from age. The box had no latch or handles, just a solid weight to it. Curiosity got the better of me. Inside was a tarnished silver locket with intricate engravings. It felt heavier than it should have. On the back was a faint inscription: Evelyn, always. I didn't know any Evelyns. I tucked the locket in my pocket, thinking it was a piece of history. That's when the whispers began, soft, breathy sounds just outside my ear. At first I thought it was the wind, but the night was windless. The whispers stayed faint, like the rustling of dry leaves, but always just close enough to unsettle me. That night the house creaked and groaned, as old houses do, but the whispers circled the room. I buried my head in my pillow, but they didn't stop. The next day, shadows in the house seemed to move differently, fleeting glimpses of figures darting behind doorways. I began to feel watched. Every room felt like a stage, and I was the only actor performing for a silent observer. Desperate for answers, I dug into the house history. Newspaper clippings and town records yielded nothing about Evelyn, but the blueprints revealed a discrepancy. A small room off the dining area that didn't exist anymore. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, though they never formed words. One evening, I found an old photo album. The black and white images showed the family who lived here before me. One photo stood out: a young girl with pale skin and piercing dark eyes. Around her neck was the locket I'd found. Flipping the photo over, I found her name: Evelyn. Evelyn. Shadows moved openly, forming shapes at the edge of my vision. The locket in my hand vibrated, ice cold against my palm. Every fiber of my being screamed to leave. I replaced the locket in the box, slid it back under the floorboards, and left the house. I locked the door behind me and never returned. The keys went to a real estate agent. I didn't mention Evelyn, the whispers, or the missing room. I just wanted to be far away. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear faint whispers, carried on the wind or through the creaking pipes. I always make sure my windows are locked, very tightly locked. I can't let her find me. Story 3. It started with the renovations. Not the glamorous kind you see on TV, but this old house is falling apart kind. My grandfather left me his place, a rambling Victorian in a forgotten town. The house was in rough shape, peeling paint, overgrown gardens, and a musty smell that clung to everything. I knew it would be a project, but I wasn't prepared for what I found. It was a Tuesday. I was pulling up old linoleum in the kitchen, the kind with faded floral patterns that looked both innocent and sinister. The setting sun cast distorted shadows through dusty windows. Beneath the floorboards, I found a small wooden box, dark and smooth, almost black from age. The box had no latch or handles, just a solid weight to it. Curiosity got the better of me. Inside was a tarnished silver locket with intricate engravings. It felt heavier than it should have. On the back was a faint inscription. Evelyn, always. I didn't know any Evelyns. I tucked the locket in my pocket, thinking it was a piece of history. That's when the whispers began, soft, breathy sounds just outside my ear. At first I thought it was the wind, but the night was windless. The whispers stayed faint, like the rustling of dry leaves, but always just close enough to unsettle me. That night the house creaked and groaned, as old houses do, but the whispers circled the room. I buried my head in my pillow, but they didn't stop. The next day, shadows in the house seemed to move differently, fleeting glimpses of figures darting behind doorways. I began to feel watched. Every room felt like a stage, and I was the only actor performing for a silent observer. Desperate for answers, I dug into the house history. Newspaper clippings and town records yielded nothing about Evelyn, but the blueprints revealed a discrepancy. A small room off the dining area that didn't exist anymore. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, though they never formed words. One evening, I found an old photo album. The black and white images showed the family who lived here before me. One photo stood out. A young girl with pale skin and piercing dark eyes. Around her neck was the locket I found. Flipping the photo over, I found her name. Evelyn. Evelyn. Shadows moved openly, forming shapes at the edge of my vision. The locket in my hand vibrated, ice cold against my palm. Every fiber of my being screamed to leave. I replaced the locket in the box, slid it back under the floorboards, and left the house. I locked the door behind me and never returned. The keys went to a real estate agent. I didn't mention Evelyn, the whispers, or the missing room. I just wanted to be far away. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear faint whispers, carried on the wind or through the creaking pipes. I always make sure my windows are locked, very tightly locked. I can't let her find me. Story 4. It was just supposed to be a weekend camping trip. Nothing fancy, just me and my old dog, Gus, out in the woods. We've been doing this for years, same spot by the Black River, same routine. I like the quiet there. It's a kind of quiet you can't find anywhere else, not even in the deepest parts of the city. This time, though, this time was different. I can't ignore that. The place we go is about a mile off the old logging road, past the rusted-out shell of a pickup truck that's been there since I was a kid. The trees close in thick right after that. Tall pines and hemlocks that block out most of the sun. Even in the middle of the day, it always feels cooler there, almost damp, even if it hasn't rained in days. We got there late Friday afternoon. I set up the tent, Gus circling me, sniffing the ground, then promptly laid down in the shade to nap. I built a small fire, just enough to boil water for coffee, and watched the shadows lengthen. The usual sounds of the woods started to pick up. The rustling in the underbrush, the call of an unseen bird, the gentle flow of the river. Nothing out of the ordinary. That first night was uneventful. I remember staring into the fire, feeling the familiar peace settle over me. Gus snored softly by my feet. I went to bed early, the sounds of the night lulling me to sleep. The tent felt secure, the usual safe haven. Saturday was normal mostly. I fished a little in the river, caught nothing. Gus kept me company, mostly just lying around, his old bones probably not feeling up to any real adventuring. We ate lunch, then I decided to go for a walk, the old path we usually follow. I didn't take Gus with me. He was getting on in years, and the path is a little rough in places. The path went through the trees, getting darker and quieter the further you go from the river. It's a path I've walked hundreds of times, but on Saturday, it felt different. The air was heavier than usual, and the silence seemed to press in on me. I kept looking over my shoulder, not for any real reason, just a feeling like something was watching me. Just at the edge of the trees, the path led me to the old cemetery, a small, forgotten burial ground hidden deep in the woods. It's not marked on any map, or I should say it wasn't marked on the older maps of the area. I found a newer map of the area that showed a small circle with a cross in its center in this particular area. I'd stumbled across it a few years back, just weathered headstones scattered among the trees. I usually give it a wide berth, but that day I felt drawn to it. There was a small clearing in the dead center. The stones were covered in moss and lichen, some nearly illegible. I knelt down and tried to brush off the dirt and moss from the nearest one, my fingers running over the cold, damp stone. It was the name of a young girl, the date of her death so long ago it was hard to read in the dim light. I felt a chill run down my spine, and it wasn't from the weather. It was a strange feeling of sadness, loss, like it was actually something I was experiencing rather than the feeling of a stranger passing by on a memorial. I didn't stay there long. I stood up, quickly, and hurried back along the path. A sense of urgency I couldn't explain pushing me forward. It felt like I was being followed. The rustling in the underbrush seemed closer, more persistent. By the time I got back to the campsite, I was breathing hard, my heart pounding in my chest. Gus was still there, of course, lying where I'd left him. I sat down and tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just my imagination working overtime. But the feeling, that lingering unease, wouldn't go away. The shadows seemed darker than they should, the woods quieter, yet somehow watchful. I built up the fire again, trying to create a barrier between me and the woods. I stayed awake as long as I could that night, staring into the flames, listening to the sounds of the night. But it was different. There was a new sound. I couldn't place it, but it seemed to vibrate through the air, making the hair on my arms prickle. Sleep finally came, but it was restless. I kept waking up, each time with a distinct feeling that something was there, right outside the tent. I'd listen intently, holding my breath, but I never heard anything definitive, just that low humming and the soft rustling that could have been anything. Every rustle made me want to grab Gus and run, but he was always asleep at my feet. I think that's what kept me from running. Sunday morning dawned gray and cold. The fire was dead, and the woods seemed to be holding their breath. I packed up my gear quickly, feeling a desperate need to leave. Gus seemed agitated too, pacing nervously, whining softly. I broke down the tent with stiff, shaking fingers. As I was putting the last of my gear into the truck, I noticed something. I know it sounds stupid, but I noticed something that I feel was not there before. It was a small, almost perfect circle of flattened grass on the far edge of the clearing where I'd set up camp. It was in the shape of a perfect ring, like something had been standing there, watching. I didn't get a good look at it, just took a mental picture and got into my truck. We left. I didn't look back. Since that weekend, things haven't been the same. I've tried to dismiss it, telling myself it was just a bad dream, a bit of heightened anxiety. But I keep seeing it in the corners of my eyes, that dark, silent presence. I keep hearing the low hum, sometimes when I'm alone in my house, sometimes just on the edge of my hearing. I can never tell where it is coming from, it's just there. I've stopped going back to the river. It doesn't feel like the peace I used to find there. It feels like a place that's watching, waiting, and I'm afraid, a deep, cold fear that I can't shake. And if I really, really think about it, the feeling is like I'm not the only one who senses something there. My dog, Gus, is always at my feet. He won't leave my side. If I try to go to the back door to go into the yard, he will sit there and stare at me, as if to say, "No, don't go out there." I can't explain it. I wish I could. I don't even really know what it is that's bothering me. But I know one thing. I won't be going back to those woods. Not ever. Story 5. It started, like most things, completely normal. I live in a small town, nestled in a kind of valley where the trees grow tall and the shadows stretch long, especially in the late afternoon. This particular week, there was a peculiar chill in the air, even for early October. A dampness that seemed to seep into your bones. I'd been doing some research for my local history blog, focusing on an old area on the edge of town, a bit of woodland known as Blackwood. It's not a big forest, really, more like a cluster of ancient trees with undergrowth that had a life of its own. Blackwood used to be the site of a small village, a farming community that vanished in the early 1900s. There were no records of plague or war, just the fact that one season they were there, and the next they were gone. The few stone foundations and overgrown wells were all that remained now. It's a place most people avoid, not because it's dangerous, but because it just feels off. I'm not one for ghost stories, but the mystery of what happened in Blackwood always intrigued me. I was always curious to get closer to it. My research had been mostly about old maps and documents up until this point, but to really get a feel for the place, I knew I had to go there to actually touch ground. So, last Tuesday, I went. I parked my car on the old logging road at the edge of the woods, carefully noting the time. 2:17 p.m. The afternoon sun was filtering through the leaves, creating a dappled pattern on the forest floor. The light was this soft, almost golden yellow that felt almost like a movie. It was beautiful, but there was something about it that made me nervous. I'd prepared myself, though. I had my camera, my notebook, and a bottle of water. It was meant to just be short. Take a few pictures, get a sense of the place. The air in Blackwood was heavy, almost suffocating. It was like entering a room that had been closed for a very long time. The trees, some so wide I couldn't have wrapped my arms around them, looked like they were watching me, their branches reaching like gnarled fingers. There were no sounds, not even birds, just the soft crunch of my boots on the fallen leaves and my own breath. I walked slowly further in, following a barely bare trail that I assumed was once a village path. I would stop every few feet, turning in every direction, not just to see, but also, it felt, to listen. I took a few pictures, noting the way the light fell through the trees and on the moss-covered stones. The foundations of the old houses were barely visible, mostly just shapeless piles of stones now. One place felt more prominent than the others, and I felt drawn to it. The stones made an almost perfect circle, and in the center, the gaping hole where I could see a dark opening, an old well. I took out my notebook and started sketching the layout of the remains, trying to imagine what it might have been like when people lived here. As I sketched, I was aware of this odd sense of being watched. a prickly feeling on the back of my neck. I told myself it was just the silence, the isolation. When I felt a gust of wind, a cold rush that went right through me, I did a double take, a shiver going down my spine. It was a wind that felt not natural. It died down as fast as it arrived. After about an hour, I packed up my things. I decided to head back with my sketches and photos. I felt a sense of urgency, an unexplainable desire to leave. I began to follow the path I had come, but something was off. It didn't look the same. The trees seemed taller, the path less distinct. I tried to remember the direction of the logging road, but even that seemed hazy in my mind, as if I'd forgotten which way was which. I started walking faster, trying to keep a straight line, the feeling of being watched growing stronger, more oppressive. It was in my chest now, a heavy feeling that made breathing difficult. I checked my watch. 3:45 p.m. Time seemed to have sped up. It felt like it had been hours since I arrived. I kept walking, hoping I would stumble upon a recognizable landmark, the edge of the woods, anything. The light was fading now, the sky turning a bruised purple. The woods were even darker, the shadows deeper. I fumbled in my bag for my phone to check them out. The signal was weak, almost non-existent. The phone was useless. I realized I was lost. The panic began to set in, a cold wave washing over me. I pulled out my water, and my hands were shaking as I took a few sips. The woods were silent, still. The wind was gone, replaced with a feeling of something malevolent. I glanced back and was sure I saw movement, a shape in the trees, but when I looked again, it was gone. I started to walk again, blindly now. The feeling of being watched was stronger, closer. I could swear I heard footsteps behind me, soft and deliberate. But when I turned around, there was nothing. I kept turning. I felt like I was being taunted. I started to sweat, despite the chill in the air. I kept going, pushing through the undergrowth, desperate to find a way out. The sun had disappeared completely now, and the woods were pitch black. I tried to see through the dark, but it was a blackness that felt thick, impenetrable. With the sun gone, I was more afraid. My heart was pounding against my ribs, and the sounds of the forest were coming closer. I could hear the crunching of leaves, the rustling of branches, all around me. But when I tried to see, I never could. I pulled out my phone and tried the flashlight. The beam of light was like a wound in the dark, but it was so small, it barely worked. It was enough to see the strange shapes the trees made, the darkness around me, the feeling that something was there, close. I heard a soft whistle, a low sound that sent a shiver through my entire body. It wasn't like any human whistle. It felt ancient. I tried to keep my footsteps quiet. I kept walking, the flashlight beam dancing ahead of me, the woods closing in. The sounds were getting louder, closer. I could hear the crunching of leaves closer, much closer now, like someone was walking just behind me, but still I couldn't see it. I started to run, blindly, through the dark, the branches scratching my face, the undergrowth tripping me up. I could hear the sounds getting faster, closer, keeping pace with me. I stumbled and fell, landing hard on the cold, damp ground, my phone flying from my hand. The light went out. I lay there, trying to catch my breath, my heart pounding in my ears. I felt a presence, much stronger than before now, hovering above me. I could feel it, the way you can feel the heat off a fire. I couldn't move. The sounds were right there, all around me, taunting me. I closed my eyes, waiting. I don't know how long I laid there. When I finally gathered the strength to get up, the sounds were gone. The woods were quiet again, except for the soft rustling of leaves. I found my phone, the flashlight still on. The screen cracked. I looked around. I wasn't exactly sure where I was, but I walked forward. I felt a sense of direction again, like something had shifted. And I saw light. I followed the light and found myself back on the logging road, barely able to see by the light of the moon. My car just a few feet away. I didn't stop. I just got in and drove. The drive home was a blur. I got home, locked the door, and just sat on the floor, trying to calm the racing of my heart. I had a quick shower, changed my clothes, and got into bed. But I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing the dark trees, the shadows, the feeling of being watched. I kept hearing the sounds, the crunching of leaves, the whistle. It's been 3 days since then, and I haven't been back. I don't think I will ever go back. I still see it when I close my eyes. I still feel it. The way I felt like I was not alone. I'm writing this to try to make sense of it, to try to get it out of my head. But as I write, I keep looking over my shoulder, feeling like I'm still being watched. I go to the window, looking into the dark yard, and seeing nothing, but feeling the presence of something. All the same. I don't know what happened in Blackwood, but I know it's not just an old village anymore. There's something there, something else. And I think it knows I was there too. Story 6. The wind here is a living thing, I swear. Not just a breeze, not just a storm, but something that breathes and sighs. And sometimes it sounds like it's whispering your name. I've been at the Crystal Jug research station for about 3 weeks now. It's supposed to be a meteorological observation post, but it feels more like a forgotten tomb in the middle of a frozen ocean. We're supposed to be monitoring atmospheric pressure, ice shelf movement, and a few other things. Pretty standard stuff. Just me and 2 other guys, old-timers from the university. Dr. Erickson, the lead researcher, is a bear of a man, perpetually bundled in layers and mumbling about barometric readings. Then there's Lars, who spends most of his time fiddling with the radio antenna, trying to pick up a signal from, well, practically anywhere. The station itself is a cluster of prefabricated buildings, all connected by a narrow metal walkway. The paint is peeling, the metal groans in the cold, and the whole place feels like it's slowly sinking into the ice. It's never completely dark here. Not really, even at night. The perpetual twilight of the Arctic winter casts long, unsettling shadows, making the landscape look like some alien world. At first, it was just the isolation that got to me, the endless white landscape, the roar of the wind, the feeling of being utterly cut off from the world. There's this quiet, almost hollow feeling in the air here. It's like the sound has been sucked away, leaving just a strange, throbbing silence. Then, the little things started. Small things that you could easily dismiss if you didn't happen to be alone on a desolate research station, with nothing but your thoughts for company. Footsteps, for instance. At first I thought it was Lars, always stomping around in his clunky boots. But the footsteps sounded lighter, more like someone in thin shoes, not thick. Insulated ones like us. I'd hear them in the main corridor, outside my sleeping quarters, a quick light patter that would vanish as quickly as it began. I told the others. Erickson grumbled about the wind playing tricks, and Lars just shrugged. His gaze fixed on his radio. I started sleeping with my earplugs in. But even then, sometimes I'd still catch the faint, quick pat, pat, pat before falling asleep. The next thing was the smell. It was this strange, metallic odor, like blood on old iron. It wasn't consistent, just a whiff here and there. Usually early in the morning when I'd go get coffee from the mess hall. I checked all the equipment, looked for a leak, something, but found nothing. The others couldn't smell it. They said I was imagining things. I started to doubt myself. One afternoon, I found a small, hand-carved wooden figure tucked between the drawers in the supply room. It was crudely made, like a child's toy. This little stick figure with wide, staring eyes etched into the wood. I didn't recognize it, and none of us had ever brought anything like that here. I asked, of course, but the others just stared back, their faces blank. I put the little figure back where I found it, but it was gone the next day. I looked everywhere for it, but never saw it again. It was like it disappeared into thin air. I felt that creeping sense of dread start to settle into my bones. The radio became another source of unease. Lars wouldn't stop fiddling with it, trying to find a signal. One moment, it was just static. Then, for a fraction of a second, I hear voices. Not clear. Understandable voices, but like a garbled mix of whispers, almost like they were coming from underwater. Again, I asked them if they heard it, but again they said no. Then one morning, Lars was gone. No sign of him, no note. Just gone. His bed looked like he'd never slept in it. His coat was still hanging on the hook. Erickson and I searched the entire station, called on the radio a dozen times. Nothing. It was like he simply vanished. Erickson kept saying he must have gone for a walk, but after 5 hours, he started to get concerned. We searched outside. The wind had drifted the snow against the buildings, making huge drifts. We tried to find his footprints, but only the wind was now making them. I was terrified. I could see the fear in Erickson's eyes, too. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept hearing the footsteps, the quick pat, 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 pat outside my room. I swear they were closer than before. The metallic smell was stronger, too, heavy in the air, making my throat feel tight. I went looking for Erickson, but his room was empty. His bed was untouched. I found his coat on the floor near the mess hall. I walked outside one more time, just hoping it might give me anything to indicate where they could have gone. I don't know what I was looking for, but the silence was thick and heavy. The sky was a sickly gray, and the snow seemed to twist and swirl. I'm alone now, completely alone. I've locked myself in the communications room. The radio is crackling, the whispers coming in clearer now. They're singing, I think, a low, monotonous chant that seems to vibrate in the bones of my skull. And the footsteps, they're right outside the door now. The metallic smell is overpowering, like I've been dunked into a bucket full of old blood. I'm writing this because I don't know what else to do. I can hear it now. It's not really footsteps anymore. It's more like a dragging sound. They're getting closer. I can feel something on the other side of the door. It's cold, so cold, like the ice outside. Something is pressing against the door now. I'm terrified to see what it is. The radio has gone completely silent. All I can hear is the dragging and the breathing. It's directly on the other side of the door now. I don't know how much longer this door will hold for. I think they're going to come in. Story 7. It all started, I guess, with the job. I'd always wanted to live by the coast. Always. So, when I landed a gig as a night security guard at the old Portside Library in Aberystwyth, Wales, I was over the moon. The library itself is beautiful. All grey stone and big arched windows that look out over the Irish Sea. During the day, it's a place buzzing with students and families. But at night, it's a different animal. My first few shifts were pretty uneventful. Typical late-night stuff. Lots of quiet. The occasional floorboard creaking. The wind howling in from the sea. The library was always cold, though. Even in summer. A deep, persistent cold that seemed to seep into your bones. It's a building that holds its secrets well, I started to realize. The place was always dimly lit. even with the security lights they installed, just enough to see the silhouettes of bookshelves, the ghostly shapes of the reading chairs. You could feel the weight of all those stories, all that knowledge, just hanging heavy and dense in the air. I'd do my rounds, slowly turning the keys in the locks of the reading rooms, always checking for anything out of place. At first, it was just boring. Then the boredom started to feel like something else. It started subtly, a flicker, a whisper. I'd be walking past the reference section and catch a flash of movement out of the corner of my eye. Just a brief shift in the shadows that made me pause. I'd look, and of course, there was nothing there. Just the rows and rows of books, silent and still. I dismissed it as tiredness, the effects of the late shift. After all, my mind was probably playing tricks on me. Then came the noises. Not loud, not sudden. They were softer than that, more insidious. A gentle rustling, like pages being turned, even though I'd made sure all the doors were locked when I arrived. That sound really started to get under my skin. I'd find myself stopping mid-walk, listening intently, trying to pin down the source. It always seemed to move, like it was just out of my range of hearing, or right behind me. One night, it was worse. The rustling became a soft scratching, like claws on wood. I found myself drawn into the children's section. The small, brightly colored shelves looking out of place in the dim light. I ran my hand along the spines, felt the worn covers under my fingertips. The scratching was louder here, and I swear I could feel a tiny breeze that didn't match the wind outside. It was as if something was right behind me, breathing. I backed out of the section quickly, heart pounding. I started changing my route, trying to avoid the children's area. I felt ridiculous even thinking these things. It's just an old library, right? But that didn't change the feeling. This constant prickling sensation at the back of my neck. It was like being watched, like I wasn't alone. I started noticing more than just the noises. Like things were moving. Books I was sure I'd left on one shelf would now be on another. A small child-sized chair would sometimes be tilted forward, like something had just gotten up from it. No one was here but me. I checked the records. No one else has keys. The worst part, I think, was the smell. It started as a faint, musty odor, like old paper and damp earth. It grew stronger with each passing night, until it filled the air with a thick, cloying scent that made my stomach churn. It was decaying. It smelled of things that should be buried, of things that weren't meant to be seen or touched. I started avoiding the library as much as possible during the day. Even though I lived on site, the space was different then. The light made it feel safe, but the nights, there's something different again. There's something wrong, and it is getting stronger. It feels like something wants me here. It wants me to stay longer, as if this is my only place, the way the light played in the windows. Now, as the sun started to go down, feels different to me. Something was watching, and I know it. The rustling starts again, stronger now. The smell wafts through the air, thick and pungent. I know I should leave. I should get help or quit my job. But I can't. I'm drawn in, like an insect to a light. The quiet here is different to the world. The way the stories look, I want to get some of this feeling back. The sun fully sets, and the library goes quiet again. Except now the rustling has changed. It's more of a shuffling, a slow dragging. I can feel the pressure building. Like the air is getting heavy. I know that I should be scared, but it's replaced with a cold curiosity. My feet move towards the sound and the smell. There is an old feeling, like a deep ache in my soul. I keep walking, drawn to that feeling, into the children's section again. Story 8. It started, like most things, with a bit of curiosity. I was on a solo road trip, just drifting up the coast, and Port Townsend caught my eye. Not for its touristy charm, but for the way it felt different, like the buildings were holding their breath, waiting for something. I'd booked a small room and a bed and breakfast right in the heart of the old downtown, a place called the Captain's Rest. It looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1920s, which was part of its appeal, I guess. The room was small, with a single window looking out over a narrow alleyway. Even mid-afternoon, the light didn't quite penetrate the room fully. It left corners in shadow, and the air felt cool, almost damp. The wallpaper was a faded floral print, and the wooden floorboards creaked with every step. It wasn't a bad kind of creepy, just old. I spent the first day exploring, mostly by myself. The town was quiet, almost eerily so. The few people I saw seemed distant, their eyes holding a strange, unfocused look. The old Victorian houses, especially those further up the hillside, looked like they'd seen centuries of secrets. The wind off the water carried a lone moan, like a mournful song. That evening, after a mediocre dinner at a small seafood restaurant, I went back to the Captain's Rest. The fog had rolled in, thick and gray, and the streetlights cast weak, haloed circles on the wet pavement. My room felt even cooler than before, the air thick with a musty smell I couldn't quite place. Like old books and salt water mingled together. I tried reading, but the words seemed to swim on the page. I felt inexplicably restless, my gaze wandering around the room. The shadows in the corners seemed to deepen and shift. It was probably just the low light, I told myself. I settled for watching the fog press against the window. I could hear the distant clang of a buoy, repeating itself like a heartbeat. The floorboards creaked, even when I wasn't moving. I told myself it was the old house settling. But then I started to hear other sounds. The faint rustle of fabric, like someone shifting in the room. The softest of whispers, words I couldn't decipher. It was barely audible, like the sound of the wind snaking through cracks in the window frame. But it was definitely there. I lay there, frozen, listening, my heart starting to pound against my ribs. I tried to reason with myself. The old house, the wind, too much coffee, my own overactive imagination. But the sounds grew more distinct. The fabric rustled again, this time closer. I could almost feel a presence in the room, a cold spot that moved around the corners of the room. I pulled the covers tighter around me, fighting the urge to get up and turn on the light. I just wanted it to be morning. The whispers seemed to shift too, taking on a different cadence. It was still indecipherable, a kind of low, almost humming murmur, but laced with something that made my skin crawl. It felt sad. It wasn't menacing, but deeply despairing. The night felt like it stretched on forever. Every creak, every rustle, every whisper was agonizing. I didn't sleep at all. The first light of dawn offered a small reprieve. The fog had thickened overnight, making the room even darker than before. But the sounds had subsided at least. I pulled back the curtains slowly, expecting to see something out of place. Nothing, just the narrow alleyway, draped in fog, exactly as it had been the day before. I booked it out of that room as fast as I could, barely taking time to gulp down some coffee and the stale pastry in the dining room. I checked out as quickly as I could, the old woman at the front desk glancing at me with those same strangely unfocused eyes. She didn't say anything. She just looked at me and gave this small, almost sad smile. I felt better once I got out of Port Townsend. The sun was struggling to break through the fog, but it felt like a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. I drove for hours that day, trying to shake that heavy feeling, but the sound of the whispering still echoed in my mind, the despairing murmur. And I've been wondering ever since. What was it I heard? Was it just the house? Was it something else? I found myself glancing at the shadows in my apartment since, and always. There is that quiet, ever-present fear that I might just start hearing those quiet whispers again. I don't think I'll ever return to Port Townsend, but I know its damp, cold quiet is something I won't forget. It's the kind of quiet that stays with you like the echo of a broken heart. Story 9. The salt spray stung my face, a familiar welcome. I love the coast, especially in the off-season. The air hangs still and heavy. The world feels quiet, like it's holding its breath. This time, I was in Port Isaac, Cornwall, a little fishing village clinging to the cliffs. It was late October, and the summer crowds were long gone, leaving a hollow peace in their wake. I'd rented a small cottage overlooking the harbor. It was old, stone walls thick with history. The kind of place where you felt like the echoes of past lives brushed against you as you walked through the rooms. I was here to work, mostly. I'm a writer, or at least I try to be. I needed to get away. Somewhere silent, somewhere that wasn't my city apartment. Port Isaac, with its winding streets and the constant rhythm of the waves, felt like the perfect place to find my focus. The first few days were exactly what I needed. I'd wake with the sun, drink my tea overlooking the water, and then sit at the old wooden desk in the living room. The only sounds were the gentle creaking of the house settling and the mournful calls of the gulls. I'd work until the light faded. Then I'd cook a simple meal and curl up with a book. It was blissfully mundane, but by the fourth day, things started to feel off. It wasn't anything dramatic, just subtle shifts. It started with the temperature. The cottage always felt cooler than it should, even with the little fireplace going. It wasn't a bone-chilling cold, more like a damp chill that settled deep into your skin. It wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but it was persistent, like a low humming note that you could always feel, never forget. Then, there were the shadows. They seemed to deepen earlier than they should, stretching further into the corners of the rooms, twisting into shapes that weren't quite right. I'd find myself glancing past my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing there. Of course, there was never anyone. It was just the shadows, playing tricks in the dim light. One evening, I was making dinner, some simple pasta. I often found myself drawn to the window, looking out over the harbor, the lights of the fishing boats bobbing gently on the water. I noticed something odd, a single light flickering on and off in a small inlet further down the coast. It wasn't a house light or a boat light. It was too weak, too irregular. It looked like a candle flame. I watched it for a long time, trying to figure out what it could be. But eventually, I just put it down to the distance playing tricks on my eyes. I went back to eating my pasta, feeling that chill again. I'd started sleeping poorly too. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, not knowing why, my heart hammering. I'd lie in the silence, the only sound a steady rasp of the waves against the rocks below. But it never felt like I was alone. It felt like I was being watched. The air felt thick. I tried to logic it, my brain trying to convince itself it was stress. The change of environment, all that. I tried to go back to sleep, but the feeling just wouldn't lift. The next day, I decided to explore the village a bit. I walked down to the harbor, passing the small, brightly colored houses and the little shops closed for the season. I went into the pub, a cozy spot with a low ceiling and a crackling fire. I tried to be casual, asked the bartender about the area, the history, He spoke in a thick Cornish accent, mumbling about the old fishing days, about the sea, and a little about some old fishermen who'd gone missing ages ago. "Why, folks around here say the sea has secrets," he muttered, polishing a glass, his eyes looking inward. "Never gives back." He then changed the subject, and I tried to ask more, but he just gave me a quick shake of the head and moved on. I couldn't help the feeling that he knew more than he was letting on. I felt chilled, so I left and headed back towards the cottage. As I started to walk back up the narrow street, I passed an old rundown house further from the harbor. It looked abandoned, the windows boarded up, the paint peeling. I stopped and stared at it, drawn in by some silent pull. There was something about it, a feeling that clung to the very stones. It was the kind of place that felt like it was holding its breath, waiting. I shivered despite the mild day, and I suddenly felt exposed, so I hurried back to the cottage. Back inside, the cottage felt more oppressive than it had before. The air was heavy, the shadows deep, the chill penetrating. I tried to work, but I couldn't focus. My thoughts kept drifting back to the flickering light in the inlet. It wasn't just the light itself, it was the feeling that accompanied it, a sense of someone watching. I felt uneasy, the feeling that someone or something had come with me. I sat in bed, the blankets pulled up to my chin, my eyes wide in the darkness. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind outside sent a jolt of fear through me. I kept seeing that light in my mind, flickering on and off, drawing me in, and I felt them, the eyes behind them. Then I heard it, a soft, rhythmic scratching sound coming from somewhere below. It was low and persistent, like nails scraping on stone. It wasn't a rat, not a natural sound. It was too deliberate, too intentional. I got out of bed, my legs trembling. I hesitated for a long time, then decided to slowly descend the stairs, each step making an old groan in silence. I reached the bottom of the stairs, the scratching still going, seemingly coming from the cellar door. I held my breath and stood there for longer than I should. I could have sworn something moved in the shadows. It wasn't a person. It was darker, denser. I can't explain it. I had to do it. I reached out and slowly, carefully, pulled the door open, and that's as far as I'll go. The cold that spilled from that cellar door, the absolute stillness, the total absence of light. It was like staring into the absence of everything, like the earth had a mouth, and it was whispering a terrible invitation to something beyond my comprehension. I turned around, closed the door, and practically ran back upstairs. I'm packing now. I'm not staying another night. I'll find somewhere else. I don't know what's down there, honestly. I don't want to find out. I need to be somewhere bright, somewhere loud, somewhere that doesn't feel like it's holding its breath, somewhere that's not next to that sea. Story 10. For the past few months, I had been feeling increasingly uneasy in my new home. It wasn't a result of the strange neighbors or the creaky floorboards, but something much more sinister. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but I knew that something was off. One night, as I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep, I heard a faint whispering sound coming from the corner of my room. At first I thought I was imagining things, but as the sound grew louder, I knew that I wasn't alone. I sat up in bed, my heart racing, and tried to make out what the voices were saying. But no matter how hard I listened, I couldn't understand a single word. Days turned into weeks, and the whispering voices only grew louder. I could hear them even when I was outside, walking through the quiet streets of the neighborhood. I started to feel like I was being followed, like there was some unseen force that was always watching me. One day, I decided to do some research on the history of my home. I spent hours online, reading about past residents and any strange occurrences that had taken place. That's when I stumbled upon a news article from over 50 years ago. It was about a young girl who had gone missing in the neighborhood. She had been playing in the woods near her home when she vanished without a trace. As I read more about the case, I started to feel a cold chill run down my spine. The woods where the girl had disappeared were directly behind my house. The police had searched the area extensively, but they had never found any trace of the girl. That night, I couldn't sleep. The whispering voices were louder than ever, and I could feel an evil presence in my room. I got out of bed and walked over to the window. As I looked out into the darkness, I saw a figure standing in the woods. It was a young girl, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, and she was looking right at me. I blinked, and she was gone. I rushed out of the house and into the woods, determined to find out what had happened to her. As I made my way deeper into the trees, the whispering voices grew louder, and the air grew colder. Suddenly, I heard a scream. I followed the sound and found myself standing in a clearing. In the center of the clearing was a large stone well, and there, at the bottom of the well, was the girl. She was pale and lifeless, and it was clear that she had been there for a very long time. I felt a wave of sadness and fear wash over me. I knew that I had to do something to help the girl, but I didn't know what to do. As I stood there, trying to figure out my next move, I heard the whispering voices once again. But this time, I could understand what they were saying. "Leave this place," they said. "Leave now, before it's too late." I took their advice and ran out of the woods as fast as I could. I never went back to that house again, and I never forgot about the girl in the well. To this day, I still hear the whispering voices, and I know that she's still out there, waiting for someone to help her. Story 11. The old leather journal was brittle, its pages yellowed and smelling faintly of brine and something else. Something metallic. I'd found it tucked away in the attic of the inherited cottage, the one overlooking the jagged cliffs of the northern coast. It wasn't Blackwood. This was St. Agnes, a windswept, isolated place where the sea seemed to dominate everything, even the land. The cottage had belonged to my great-uncle, a man I knew only through fragmented family stories and a few faded photographs. Always the same stoic face looking out at a gray sea. The entry that caught my eye was dated October 17th, 1918. It was short, almost frantic. The light, it shifted. Not the beam, but the tower itself. I felt it shudder, a tremor deep in the earth. And the foghorn, it sounded like a scream. I ran a finger over the faded ink, a shiver crawling up my spine despite the afternoon sunlight streaming through the dusty attic window. My great-uncle, Silas, had been the lighthouse keeper at the nearby point, and the journal seemed to be his personal log, filled with mundane observations about the weather, the passing ships, and the occasional mended lamp. But interspersed, there were these other entries, these strange, unsettling fragments that spoke of things beyond the ordinary. The next entry was a week later. The gulls. They won't land. They circle the tower, shrieking, their cries more panicked than usual. And the scent. It's everywhere, clinging to the stone, the air. It's like rust, but alive. I decided to walk to the lighthouse the next day. It wasn't far, just a short trek along a narrow path that cut through the overgrown gorse and heather. The wind was sharp, whipping my hair across my face, and the sea below crashed against the rocks with a force that made the ground tremble under my feet. The lighthouse was imposing, a stark white tower against the perpetually gray sky, the lens at its top like a giant, unblinking eye. The door was unlocked as if it had been left that way intentionally. Inside, it was damp and cold, the circular staircase echoing with every step I took. The air here was thick with the metallic smell mentioned in the journal, a scent that made my stomach churn. It was stronger here, more intense. I reached the lantern room, the massive Fresnel lens dominating the space. Dust motes danced in the shafts of gray light that filtered through the grimy windows. I walked carefully around the lens. It seemed raw. I couldn't pinpoint it exactly, but something about the way it reflected the light, the slight distortion at certain angles, felt profoundly unsettling. In the corner of the room, I noticed something tucked behind the mechanism that rotated the lens. It was a small leather-bound book, similar to the journal I found, but older. The leather dry and cracked. I opened it. The script was different, archaic. It seemed to be a different language, or maybe even just a very old version of English. While I couldn't decipher it, there were crudely drawn images interspersed throughout the text. Strange, angular symbols, depictions of figures writhing and contorting in unnatural ways. One drawing in particular caught my eye. It was an image of the lighthouse itself, but the tower wasn't straight. It was warped, twisting inwards on itself. The beams of light were jagged and fragmented. I flipped the page and I noticed another image. This time the lighthouse's lens, but twisted and contorted into an eye. That night, back at the cottage, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that clung to me. The wind howled outside, and I could have sworn I heard the foghorn, a long, mournful sound that had no place in the current weather. I flipped back to the images of the lighthouse in the second book. It did not look like the lighthouse. It was as if the thing I had visited that day was something else entirely, something that had taken the place of the lighthouse. Sleep was impossible. I tossed and turned in the old bed, a pervasive scent of rust and something else clinging to the air, and the strange images burned behind my eyelids. Over the next few days, I made regular trips back to the lighthouse, always finding myself drawn to that unsettling, distorted lens. During a visit, the light was beginning to fade when I noticed a small, dark stain on the floor. It was sticky, almost tar-like. As I bent closer, I saw it was connected by a thin line to the wall. The line stretched further into the shadows. I got a closer look. It was not a solid line. There was small dark specks, too many to count. I followed the line as it climbed the wall and disappeared into the dark recess of the ceiling. Another day I tried to trace these lines. They were everywhere and seemed to move. I noticed them on the lens too. Something was growing in the lighthouse. Something I didn't understand. The journal entries were getting more frequent, panicked, almost incomprehensible. Words like shifting and feeding were now repeated. The last entry was a single word. It's coming. The last time I visited, I did not even reach the light room. From the bottom of the stairs, I could see, no, not a lens. It was a giant eye, moving, blinking. At that point, I ran. Now, back in the cottage, with the wind howling like a tormented animal, I feel them too. The shifting and the things it brings. The shadows in the corner seem to move at the corner of my eye. The metallic scent is now so strong it's almost unbearable. And I think I can hear the whispers too. I don't know what Silas did, what he saw. I understand now that the lighthouse isn't just a building. It's something else. Something hungry. And I believe, with a growing certainty, that it wants me too. The wind picks up again, and I feel the floorboards tremble. It's here. Story 12. The desert air, even at night, holds a dry, rasping heat. It wasn't the heat that bothered me, though. It was the stillness, the absolute absence of sound besides the crunch of tires over the hard-packed salt. I'd driven for hours, the highway a black ribbon unwinding behind me, until I finally reached the turnoff to the old research station. Some called it the ghost lab, others more simply, the place where they disappeared. My research grant was covering a paper on abandoned scientific facilities, and, honestly, this one intrigued me more than most. The official reports were vague. Something about unresolved inconsistencies in data, then a sudden evacuation. No press releases, no follow-ups, just a hushed silence. The kind of silence that screams of secrets. The station itself was a low, concrete structure, blending into the stark landscape. The paint, originally pale blue, was now faded, cracked, and peeling like sunburnt skin. I parked my truck, the engines ticking as it cooled a stark sound in the vast quiet. The moon, a pale disk overhead, cast long, skeletal shadows that seemed to shift as I watched them. I pulled my pack out of the cab, the weight familiar and comforting. It contained everything I'd need. Camera, recorders, some basic tools, and a notebook for observations. I remember taking a deep breath to force some calmness on myself. The front door, the heavy steel thing, stood ajar, not wide open, just enough to be unnerving, like someone had left in a hurry and didn't bother closing. The metal groaned when I pushed it open further, the sound echoing weirdly in the stillness. The air inside was thick, stagnant, and smelled faintly of ozone and dust. The main lab area was large, with rows of empty metal tables. Everything was coated in a fine layer of salt dust, giving the room a ghostly, uniform gray. Equipment lay scattered. A broken beaker here, a tangled mess of wires there. A sense of urgency, frozen in time. I started my tour, walking slowly, my footsteps echoing off the walls. I tried to imagine the people who had worked here, the scientists, the technicians. What had they been studying? What had gone wrong? There were no real papers or files left, only the detritus of their work. I noticed the narrow hallway leading deeper into the building. The air became colder as I walked down it, the stale scent of ozone more pronounced. My recorder was doing its job, picking up the subtle sounds of my boots and my breathing. I heard something, though. I don't know what it was. The hallway opened into a smaller room, this one with a single heavy metal door. The door was slightly ajar, the same way the front door was. When I peered through the crack, I saw it was a small circular room. The walls made of some sort of smooth, dark material. There was a pedestal in the center, and a circular indent on it. I wanted to believe it was just part of the lab's construction plan, but I didn't believe it. I pushed the door open, the metal grinding unnervingly. The room seemed to draw the light in, leaving the edges in shadow. As I looked around the walls, I noticed very fine lines, almost like writing, etched into them. I took a closer look. They weren't letters. I couldn't interpret them, but I feel that they have some meaning. I pulled out my camera, wanting to document the writing. As I took the pictures, a low hum started in the room. I didn't see where it was coming from. It wasn't a mechanical hum. It felt more organic. The air, already cold, seemed to grow colder, and I had goosebumps all over my body. I stepped back out of the room, and the humming stopped. I waited for a second, and nothing. I went back in, and the humming started again. I did this several times, and each time the hum would return when I entered the circular room. I spent a bit more time in the room, documenting what I could. The sun had set now, and the desert sky was a deep, inky black. A single moon was the only source of light, and the shadows in the lab had grown longer and darker. I noticed the wind outside started to pick up, and I could hear it whistling through the gaps in the building. I wasn't sure why, but I felt I needed to leave. I turned to leave, and that's when I saw it. A figure just on the edge of my vision, a dark shape in the hallway. Something impossible that wasn't there before. I only saw it briefly, a flicker in between lighting. I turned directly towards it, and just like that, it was gone. I kept moving, not wanting to stay any longer. I moved as quickly as I could, back to the front door. Could hear the wind howling louder now. The shadows grew as I moved, almost as though they were chasing me. I reached the front door and rushed out, not looking back. As I got into the truck, I could hear the wind, but also something else, barely there, like a whisper carried on the breeze. It wasn't like any wind I have ever heard before. I closed the door, starting the engine as quickly as I could, and got out of there, back into the blackness. I drove for another hour before stopping. The silence was back, only broken by the sound of the engine. I sat there, trying to wrap my head around what happened. I replayed the audio and listened to the hum. It was faint, but I was sure of it. I heard it inside that circular room. I don't know what they were doing in that place, but it is clear to me that something horrible did happen. I don't think I will be going back there. Story 13. The house had been empty for years, abandoned by the previous owners. It sat at the edge of town, a skeletal silhouette against the darkening sky. I hadn't intended to go in. Not really. I was just walking my dog, and the gate was hanging open, beckoning me. There were no keep-out signs, no obvious warnings, just a sense of neglect that seemed to pull at you. The front door was unlocked, creaking open with a groan when I pushed it. The air inside was stale, thick with dust, smelling of damp wood and something else, something metallic, like old blood. My dog, usually eager to explore, whimpered and tucked herself behind my legs. There was a strange silence in the house. It wasn't just the absence of noise. It was more like all sound was being absorbed. My pulse picked up as I went further into the house. The living room was sparse, just a few overturned pieces of furniture, the wallpaper peeling like sunburned skin. The windows were covered in grime, letting in just the faintest bit of light. I moved into the hallway, each step echoing in the silence. Then, I heard it. Not a sound, exactly. More like a feeling. A low, constant hum in the air. A vibration that seemed to resonate in my chest. It was almost like static, the kind you might hear on an untuned radio. But it wasn't coming from any speaker. It felt like it was everywhere, filling the room. The feeling was building, the static growing stronger. I continued into the kitchen, where the hum warped the silence. The hairs on my arms stood up, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The kitchen was bare, but there were stains on the floor, dark and dried. I was starting to feel uneasy, starting to regret having come inside. I needed to leave, to get out of the house, but something kept me moving, like I was moving on a track and couldn't get off. I found the stairs and started to climb. The old wood creaked with every step. The static was almost deafening on the landing, a constant, vibrating thrum. I felt disoriented, like my focus was blurring. I reached the top of the stairs and pushed open the first door I saw. The room was empty, save for a broken mirror on the wall. But the static was no different here than it was before. It felt like the static was coming from the house itself. Like the old timbers and rotting walls were vibrating with some unknown energy. I wanted to leave. Badly. But I felt like I was glued to the floor. I went to the window and saw my dog still cowering, looking up at the house. I felt a surge of anger that put the house to shame. I wanted out. I turned around and went back to the stairs, running as fast as I could. I pushed past the first door I ran into and finally got to the front door. I ran to my car and then didn't stop driving until I was miles away from the town. Even now, days later, the static lingers. Sometimes, in the quiet of my home, I think I feel the vibration in the air and the static. I can still feel that the house is still there, and I'm worried that one day it will find me. It's like a constant low hum in my head. It's making me anxious all the time. It makes me worry that I'll go back, even though I don't want to. Story 14. The commute was the same as always. A crowded train, the same tired faces, the same monotonous journey. I usually tried to bury myself in a book, but today, the reflection in the window kept tugging at my attention. It wasn't my reflection. It started subtly. I'd glance up, and for a split second, I'd see someone else staring back at me. A flicker, a trick of the light, I'd assume. It was an old woman with a gaunt face, her eyes dark and hollow. She was sitting in the seat behind me, according to the reflection. I turned around, but there was no woman there. The seat behind me was empty. The window was slightly dirty, and I convinced myself that it was just a trick of light, some strange play between the grime and the sun. I tried to focus on my book, but every few minutes, my gaze would be drawn back to the reflection, and the woman would be there. Always the same image, never changing. As the train continued its journey, the image in the window became more persistent. The old woman's face was no longer a flicker. It was a clear and unwavering image. Her eyes seemed to bore into mine, and a strange unease settled in my stomach. I started to feel hot and uncomfortable. I wanted to move, to change my seat, but I found myself paralyzed with a strange kind of fear. I was both desperately aware of the reflection and unable to break my gaze. I started to perspire, and my chest felt tight. The air in the train seemed to thicken around me, making it hard to breathe. The train started to slow down. I looked out the window to check which station we were coming into. I was so close to home. I let out a sigh of relief, but as we pulled into the platform, the old woman's reflection stared at me again. This time, she looked angrier. Her dark, wide eyes were fixed on me, and she slowly turned her head to the right, as if she was about to get on. I jumped up from my seat, throwing my book back into my bag, and bolted towards the doors. The doors opened, and I pushed through the crowd, ignoring the irritated looks from other commuters. The moment I stepped onto the platform, I felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. I looked back at the train, and the woman was suddenly gone from the window. There was no reflection, just the drab interior of the carriage. She had never been there, but on the walk home, I kept glancing over my shoulder. The sense of being watched was still there, a prickly sensation on the back of my neck. I got home and locked all my doors and pulled all the blinds. Safe inside, the feeling still lingers, like a cold hand pressed against my skin. I can still see her face. I know that when I close my eyes, she's still there, watching me. I worry that I will see her again. I worry that one day, she will not just be in the reflection. Story 15. The old Blackwood Sanatorium had always been a place people talked about in hushed tones. A local legend wrapped in decaying brick and whispered rumors, but I never really paid it much mind. I'd driven past it countless times. The skeletal building hunched on the hill overlooking the town, a constant reminder of something unwanted. It wasn't until last fall, during one of my usual aimless drives through the countryside, that something shifted. I was taking the back roads, the ones that wind tighter than a serpent's coil, trying to clear my head after a particularly rough week. The air was crisp and smelled like damp earth and dying leaves, and the sky was the color of bruised plums. I found myself pulled towards the old sanatorium again. I hadn't intended to, but I somehow veered down the overgrown driveway, its broken asphalt cracking beneath my tires. This time, though, I didn't just drive by. I stopped the car, the engine ticking like a nervous heart. The silence was profound, broken only by the rustling of dead leaves clinging to the brittle branches. For a moment, I just stared at the building. The windows were black, staring back at me like empty sockets. some boarded up with rotting wood. I had never parked this close before. It felt different. I wasn't curious, not really. More like a moth drawn to a flickering flame. A strange, uneasy pull. I got out of the car, my boots crunching on the ground. The wind picked up, a low, mournful howl that seemed to seep through the very stones of the building. I walked towards the front entrance, a grand, if dilapidated archway. I shouldn't have gone inside. I knew that instantly. But I did. The air inside was heavy, still. It smelled like old dust and something else. Something vaguely metallic. The light filtering through the few remaining windows only served to paint the peeling walls in shades of sickly yellow and gray. It was like stepping into a tomb, one that had long been forgotten. I moved slowly, my footsteps echoing eerily in the silence. I walked through the main hall, or what I assumed was the main hall, past empty rooms, each one more desolate than the last. There were remnants of what might have been beds, scattered like forgotten bones. A single tattered curtain hung from a broken rod, swaying gently in a non-existent breeze. It felt like something was watching me, not in a menacing way, not yet, but in a way that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I was becoming increasingly uncomfortable. I explored more of the ground floor, each room revealing more of the sanatorium's decay, but nothing truly remarkable. Just the echoes of abandonment. The feeling of being watched was still present, though, like a persistent whisper at the edge of hearing. As I moved to the staircase, the feeling intensified and I stopped. The staircase was dark, the steps worn smooth by countless feet, or perhaps something else. The wood creaked under my weight as I ascended, each step sounding unnaturally loud in the suffocating silence. The higher I went, the colder it seemed to get. The air felt heavy, almost pressing against me. I felt like I was wading through a thick, invisible fog. Upstairs, the rooms were smaller, more personal somehow. I stepped into one room, and the floorboards groaned under my weight. There was a rusty metal cot in the corner, the mattress a collection of dust and torn fabric. I noticed then, for the first time, a small inscription carved into the wall beside the cot. It was nearly unreadable, the letters faded and uneven, and I had to lean in to see it. It looked like initials, JM, and below them, a number 1927. Just a name, just a date. But why someone carved it into the walls? I pulled back, and suddenly I felt the wind. It wasn't a breeze coming through a window, but a cold air that I felt on the back of my neck. I hadn't felt wind indoors before. I moved to the next room, and the next, finding more of the same, bare walls, broken furniture, the occasional inscription. Then there was a change I felt in the air. The feeling of being watched had shifted. It felt like something else was happening. I couldn't tell what, but a sense of unease was slowly turning into dread. I found myself in an area that appeared to have been a bathroom, with rusted pipes and broken tiles. The air was even colder here, and there was a faint scent of chlorine, an old, lingering kind. I looked at the sink and water dripped from the faucet. Water on when no one was here. I had to get out of here. I turned, and that's when I saw, or thought I saw, a shadow in the doorway. It was fleeting, just a flicker at the edge of my vision. I blinked, and it was gone. But the dread that had begun to build was now a tangible thing, a cold knot in my stomach. I didn't run. I couldn't. I just started walking more quickly back towards the staircase. I took the steps two at a time, wanting to be out of the building and away from the lingering dread. But as I reached the bottom of the stairs, it happened again. Another flicker, a shadow in the periphery of vision. This time it didn't disappear. It moved towards me. Not quickly, but methodically, almost as if it was pulling itself towards me. I bolted, running faster than I had ever run before. I didn't look back. I just kept moving, the breath stinging my lungs as I ran through the main hall and out into the cold evening air. I didn't stop until I was back in my car, my fingers fumbling with the keys as I started the engine. My heart was pounding, my hands were shaking. I drove away, my eyes fixed on the road. The image of the shadow burned into my mind. I kept expecting to see it in the rearview mirror, but there was nothing. For the next month, I made a point to stay away from that road. The memory of that place was still too fresh, too real. I hadn't told anyone about it, partially because I knew they wouldn't believe me, and also because I didn't want to talk about it. It was my experience, my fear, and I didn't want to share it. But the sanatorium wasn't done with me. Late one night, the power was out, and the old house I grew up in was almost completely dark. I decided to use the computer when I suddenly saw an image on my screen, a grainy, distorted photo of a room, and in the bottom corner, the words, JM 1927. I immediately turned it off, but the image had been burned in my mind. I can't make any sense of the events, but that image still haunts me, and I know, somehow, that I will never be able to completely forget about Blackwood Sanatorium, or whatever happened within its walls. I still have a nagging feeling I will go back. I don't know why, but I know I will. This is only the beginning. Story 16. The dust motes danced in the single ray of afternoon sun slicing through the grimy window. I'd been back in the old family place, Blackwood Manor, for a week now, tasked with sorting through things. It's always been a bit of a relic, a place time seemed to forget. The local villagers always whispered about it, about how the walls seemed to hold more than just plaster and brick. I always wrote it off as small-town folklore. Until now, this past week, the silence has been different. Not the peaceful silence of an empty house, but a heavy, expectant silence, like the air itself is listening. It sits on you, this silence, and it's been creeping into my sleep. I wake up sometimes, heart hammering, not from a dream I can remember, but from a feeling that something has shifted while I was unconscious. It's a low hum, a vibration just outside the range of hearing that makes the hairs on my arms prickle. Today, though, I decided it was time to move outside the manor. There's a small ancient woods behind the property. Barely more than a thicket, but it's always had a pull on me. Growing up, I was forbidden to venture in there. The old stories my grandmother would tell about people going in and simply never returning. Of course, she probably just didn't want to lose one of her grandchildren in there. But the fear still lingered. I crossed the overgrown garden, the weeds catching in my boots. The air heavier here, almost damp. The woods swallowed the light and sound. It was that particular shade of green that feels oppressive. The kind that makes you want to keep one eye over your shoulder. The trees twisted in unnatural ways, branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. There was an odd lack of wind, and the only sounds were the soft rustle of leaves and my own breathing, which seemed amplified to an uncomfortable degree. I pushed deeper in. A small stream trickled from somewhere deeper, the water dark and reflecting nothing. And then I found it. It was a barely noticed structure, no more than a few stones piled up on top of each other, and some wood beams, a shrine, some kind of marker. Some kind of marker? I crouched down, running a hand over one of the moss-covered stones. It was unnaturally cold, even in the afternoon sun. A shiver ran through me, not entirely from the chill. I had a feeling I had been watched, but there was no evidence of anything being there. I looked around. Nothing. I made sure to mark the way back, just in case, and spent maybe 20 minutes there before finally leaving the woods, getting back to the manor. The house felt different now, even more oppressive than before. I went into the study, the room my grandfather always spent his time in, poring over old books and papers. His old leather chair was still in front of a large desk, everything untouched. I went to sit in it, and it was then I noticed the book on the desk. It was an old journal, its pages brittle and yellowed. Intrigued, I reached for it and opened to the start. The first thing that caught me was the date. It was from 1963, the year my grandfather went to war. The year my grandmother said he was never the same. I started to read, and I was hooked. He'd written about the woods, about the feeling of being watched, but not in a way I'd felt before. He'd written it as if the woods themselves were an animal, an entity, and he was walking inside its stomach. About the shrine, he talked about finding it, and how he'd felt a sense of dread when he'd been near it. A coldness, he said, had followed him home, and lingered in the house. Reading his words now, I felt a creeping dread crawl up my spine. Was it my grandfather who'd felt the same as me this week? Was it this journal, the same as I held now? As I was reading, I felt the same feeling in the woods, that someone was watching me. I spent an hour poring over these journal pages, each entry detailing a descent into something dark and fearful. And then, a few pages into the journal, I found a sketch. It was of a figure, inhuman, tall and gaunt, with empty black holes where the eyes should be, and long, claw-like fingers. The sketch looked like something from a nightmare. As I stared at it, I heard a creaking noise from somewhere downstairs, not the usual shift and settle of an old house, but a deliberate sounding creak, like someone placing a foot on a stair. I listened, and then a second creak, then a third. I quickly closed the book and stand up looking at the study door. What was that? Was that just the manor? I'm sure I heard something. I slowly walked out of the study, my heart pounding in my chest. Downstairs, the silence was deafening. I moved from the living room, then to the kitchen. Nothing. I'm being paranoid. I go to the main hallway. I could still hear the creaking, coming from the stairs. I slowly walk over to the stairs, making sure to look up them. I see nothing. I let out a sigh, then turn around to return to the study. As I turned and looked back to the doorway to the living room, stood a figure. It was tall and gaunt, and looked exactly like the sketch in the journal. Empty black holes stared back at me. I blinked, and it was gone. I backed away slowly, my mind racing. This couldn't have happened. Was this the feeling? The hum in the air? It was clear to me now that my grandfather and I had experienced the same thing. This wasn't just an old house. There was something sinister attached to this place. I need to get out. It felt like I was running out of time. This place was starting to change me. How long before it changes me for good? I ran to the front door, and as I opened the door and stepped outside, I felt it. That same coldness I'd felt in the woods. I quickly bolted, and didn't look back as I ran to my car. I got in, started the engine, and put the car in reverse. As I looked back to see where I was going, I saw the figure standing on the porch, watching me. I quickly turned the car around and put my foot on the accelerator, not looking back, not even once. Story 17. The old map was the first thing. I found it tucked between the pages of a dusty history book at the local library, the one I visit every Saturday just to kill time. Not a book I requested, just something that was there. The book was about the early settlers of the area, mostly farmers, and the map was a hand-drawn thing on yellowed parchment, depicting land nobody bothered to cultivate in well over 100 years. What caught my eye was a dark, irregular blotch marked Hollow Creek with a line through it. It was different, almost like it was drawn in with a different ink. Something darker, thicker. It felt wrong. Hollow Creek wasn't on any modern maps. The only creek nearby is Oak Creek. Far too ordinary to warrant a blotch from something that could very well be ink. I felt this odd draw towards it, a pull I couldn't explain. It wasn't curiosity, not exactly. More like a morbid fascination, like a moth to a flame. The area designated on the map was mostly dense woodland, with a couple of ruined stone structures barely visible on satellite imagery. No roads leading in, just miles of trees and undergrowth. I figured, all right, a little hike wouldn't hurt. I set off on a Tuesday. The weather was overcast, the kind of gray that seems to leach the color from everything. The drive out there was uneventful, just the kind of rural boredom you'd expect. I parked at the side of a dusty trail, locked my car, and started walking into the woods. The woods were quiet, unnervingly so. No bird song, no rustling of small animals, just the crunch of my boots on dry leaves and twigs. The deeper I walked, the colder it felt. It wasn't a chill just from the air. It was something else, a deep cold, the sort that goes through you. The trees were old, ancient even, their gnarled branches twisting overhead like skeletal fingers. I followed the general direction of the map. The woods did open up and led into lower ground. After what felt like an hour, I came to it, or what I thought might be it. A small clearing, almost circular, where the trees were thinner. In the middle were the remains of a stone structure, just a low wall, moss-covered and partially buried in the undergrowth. I wouldn't have thought it was anything other than more forest debris. There were no marked paths here. The land just kind of opened into this small space. It wasn't Hollow Creek, though. It was more of a clearing now, a shallow dip in the land. The air here was thick, heavy, and smelled of damp earth, and something else, something faintly metallic. That strange cold I'd felt before intensified. I could feel the hair on my arms stand up. I walked around the perimeter of the clearing. The low wall seemed to have been part of a larger structure at one time. I spotted a broken stone with letters etched into it. I knelt and brushed away the moss so I could have a look. The letters were barely visible, but I could make out Am, Tabra, and Tabula, and Bites. I'm Tunkov. Anyone local with the initials. But something in my gut made me take notes of the letters. I spent maybe 15 minutes there, just taking it all in, feeling that strange unease growing in the pit of my stomach. There wasn't anything here, at least nothing solid. No creek as the map had described. I decided I'd had enough and started to leave. It was when I began to walk away from the structure that things got stranger. I noticed a change to the forest. The trees seemed darker, the shadows longer. Though the sky was still overcast, the light seemed to have dipped. It felt like night was coming early. I looked behind me, and the trees leading out of the clearing seemed a lot more tightly packed than they had just minutes ago. I dismissed it to my own paranoia. I did feel a little disoriented. I started to walk towards the route I took in, but it didn't feel right. The trees looked different, and the ground wasn't sloping the way I'd remembered. I pulled out my phone to check the GPS, but there was no signal. I tried it again, but all it showed was a blank screen, white with a thin gray grid. I knew I wasn't going to use that. I kept walking, trying to keep my cool, telling myself it was just the woods, that I was just turned around. I was used to this, although this feeling of unease was definitely heightened. I kept heading in what I thought was the right direction, but the woods seemed to warp around me. It was like the trees were moving, the paths shifting and changing as I walked. I came to another clearing, slightly bigger than the last, but equally unsettling. In the center was a large, dead oak tree. Its branches were bare. They reached up like claws at the sky. The bark was black, like it had been charred, and a strange humming sound emanated from it. This wasn't the clearing I was just in. The one with the stone structure. I was certain of it. The light was gone now, though. The sun had finally set. Or perhaps it was just the depth of the forest covering it up. It was a dusky blackness, the kind that makes you think you aren't seeing clearly. I felt a prickle on the back of my neck, like someone was watching me. I turned around slowly, but there was nothing there. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I started to walk faster, ignoring the constant crunching under my boots. The sound was making me feel anxious, an almost manic feeling. Then I saw it. A flicker of movement in the trees, just a glimpse of something pale and indistinct. I stopped dead, heart pounding. I tried to focus my eyes, but whatever it was had vanished. I picked a direction, any direction, and began to run. Not caring about the noise I was making, kept running, not knowing where I was going, desperately trying to get out of those woods. The air got colder, and I could see my breath in front of me. I ended up on a track I didn't recognize, a dirt road that wasn't there before. I ran to the side and leaned against a tree, catching my breath. I looked back towards the forest, and it seemed like the trees were growing taller, like they were reaching up to the sky to grab me back. I started walking again. I was terrified, but the only thing to do was to keep moving. I finally came out onto a road that I knew, the one that led to my car. When I got there, it was completely dark. The doors were locked and I got in and drove home, barely processing the experience. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, expecting something to be there, some dark figure chasing me, but nothing. I haven't been back to the woods since. I still have the map hidden away in a drawer. Sometimes I take it out and look at that dark, irregular blotch, and it feels like it's looking back at me. I have no idea what's going on back there. I have no idea what I saw, or what I felt, or even if I actually saw anything. All I know is that I don't think I'll be visiting those woods anytime ever again. And maybe, just maybe, some places should stay secrets. Story 18. The air in the old library hung thick and dusty, the kind that coated your throat and left a faint, bitter taste. It wasn't my usual afternoon haunt. I mostly stuck to the newer wing, all bright lights and clean lines, but today, a strange pull had drawn me to the forgotten corner, past the biographies I never read, and into the section marked Local History. The label itself seemed to have faded, the lettering barely clinging to the spine. I'd been looking for information for a project, something beyond the usual town records. I was writing about the old Willow Creek Sanitarium, a place everyone in town tried hard to forget existed, even though it was only a few miles outside the city limits. The books here were brittle, their pages yellow and smelling faintly of mold. I ran my fingers along the spines, pausing at one that was especially worn. It was simply titled Blackwood's Chronicle. Blackwood was a town founded long before this one, a place that had disappeared from the maps. The cover was plain, dark brown leather with no ornamentation beyond the title, and it pulled me in. I carefully took it down, the weight surprisingly heavy in my hands. The first pages were filled with meticulous, elegant handwriting, detailing the founding of Blackwood, its growth, its strange isolation. There were descriptions of the surrounding woods, the dense, almost unnatural gloom that seemed to perpetually hang there. I thought about the woods that surrounded my own small city, a different kind of woods, with trails and sunlight. I read on, the descriptions turning slowly, subtly, unnerving. The writing began to talk of whispers, not just the rustling of leaves, but sounds like voices, low and murmuring, coming from the deeper parts of the woods. Then there were mentions of things seen in the periphery, flashes of movement, shapes that didn't quite resolve themselves. I shivered, despite the stuffy heat of the library, the script on the page starting to blur. I moved on to the next page. It was an account of the disappearance of a young child. taken suddenly while playing in the yard near the forest edge. The entry ended with the words, "The forest takes what it wants." I closed the book sharply, the sound echoing in the silent room. The weight of it felt different now, heavier, like it had absorbed something dark that I didn't understand. I didn't want the book anymore, didn't want to hold it. I pushed it back onto the shelf, not back in its original spot, but haphazardly. I stood up, my muscles tight, a strange discomfort settling in my chest. I quickly walked out of the dusty section and into the bright, overly bright lights of the main area, feeling a little like I had escaped something. I spent the rest of the afternoon trying to focus on my research, looking up the history of the sanitarium, how it was an experimental place, how they practiced ways of helping people that weren't so kind back then. Images of the building flashed across my mind. The tall, narrow windows, the peeling paint, and the barbed wire fence that surrounded the property. The sanitarium in Blackwood, the old town, they seemed connected now, woven together by unease. Later, I drove home, the evening sky, a dull, bruised purple. The road that ran past the woods, the ones I usually thought of as peaceful, suddenly seemed different, darker, the shadows reaching further out onto the tarmac. I kept glancing at the tree line, trying to convince myself that they were just trees, just wind. I tried to focus on the houses, the familiar sights of my town. I parked in my driveway, the silence of my house enveloping me. I went inside, turned on some lights, put the kettle on, grabbed snacks, a usual routine. Yet, I didn't feel the expected comfort. Instead, I kept feeling eyes on the back of my neck. That same dark energy I felt in the library now followed me. I kept checking the windows, the blinds, but nothing was there. I tried to watch TV, but the noise felt irritating, so I turned it off. The sudden silence more unnerving, and I found myself reaching for the book again. I knew where it was, in the library, in that old section, but it was like a physical pull. I walked to the door, the thought that if I went back to the library, I would stop feeling this way. The car was outside, the keys were in my hand, my body was pulling me. I sat in the driver's seat, the car starting with a low rumble, and I was driving back to the library. Time now approaching midnight. The building was dark, the windows like empty eyes. I had no idea why I was there, why I felt forced here. I didn't check if the doors were locked. I didn't care. I walked up to the library doors. To my surprise, the door opened. I wasn't even trying to open it. It opened on its own, a simple pull, and I was inside. The library was dark except for a strange, faint red glow coming from the old section. My feet walked me in that direction, like a magnet pulled to its metallic source. As I got closer, the red glow intensified, reflecting off the book spines. I stood there, watching, not feeling fear. It was like I was a spectator watching a movie, except this was my life. I reached the section, and there it was, the book I had touched, pulled out, and put back. It was on the floor. The book opened to a page covered in detailed drawings of the woods, and with each drawing, it became more and more twisted, more and more horrifying. The drawings were alive. The trees were bending and twisting, the shadows moving over the page. I knew I should run. I shouldn't be looking at it, but I couldn't look away. It was like my soul was pulling me into it, and a strong, cold gust of wind blew throughout the library. The pages turned, and it stopped on a blank page. It felt like the wind was whispering into my ear. I felt like I no longer belonged to myself. My hand went out and grabbed the book. I left the library, the book in my hand. I was no longer in control. I got into the car and drove, driving towards the place I had been reading about. The old town of Blackwood. It felt like I had done this many times before. The woods were on either side of me. The trees were changing. They didn't look like trees anymore. They looked like something else. The air was colder now, but it wasn't the cold of winter. It was a cold that seeped into my bones. Soon the old sanitarium came into view, and I noticed the fence was no longer a fence. It was something else, something darker. The car pulled into the grounds, and it stopped. I stepped out of the car, and all the lights went off. The woods around me seemed to press in, the shadows swallowing everything. I looked down at the book, its pages now filled with symbols that I didn't recognize. Yet they resonated with a deep, ancient part of me. It wasn't the drawing of trees anymore, but things I couldn't quite make out. Things that felt like they came from a nightmare. My breath was caught in my chest. The dark energy surrounding me was making it difficult to breathe. The book seemed to pulse with a dark light. I suddenly remembered my project, the sanitarium, and the people who had disappeared here. I closed my eyes. I knew this wasn't going to end well. I heard whispers all around me. Then it all went black. I don't know how long I was out. When I opened my eyes, I was laying on the grass, the sun rising over the horizon. My face felt wet, I think from crying. I sat up and looked around. The sanitarium was still there, but the dark aura had gone. I didn't have the book. I don't know where it went. I looked at my hands. They seemed to tremble. I felt an exhaustion, unlike anything I have felt before. I got up, walked to my car, and sat in the driver's seat. I needed to go home, to sleep. I needed to try and forget all of this. As I drove home, the sun shining brightly on me, and for the first time, I felt cold. Very cold. Story 19. The old map was brittle. The paper cracked along its folds like dried skin. I found it tucked in the back of a dusty filing cabinet at Historical Society. It wasn't a treasure map, not in the pirate sense, but it marked the original paths through the redwood groves surrounding the town of Oak Haven, California. And amongst those paths, a small, hand-drawn circle was marked with the words, Lost Cabin. The library's photocopier hummed as I made a copy. It was late, the only sound besides the machine the occasional creak of the old building settling. I'd spent the last few weeks researching missing hikers in the area. A morbid hobby, I suppose. There wasn't much to go on. A few newspaper clippings and vague reports, but all of them disappeared somewhere within those same redwood forests. And that little circle on the map kept drawing me in. The air felt different as I drove into Oak Haven a few days later. It felt heavy, almost thick, like the fog that clung to the edges of the forest. The trees were giants, their tops lost in the misty sky. I parked my old Jeep off a logging road, the gravel crunching under the tires. The map was useless for any practical navigation, I knew that. The old paths were barely visible under layers of fallen leaves. I was just following a feeling. The woods swallowed the sunlight, creating a perpetual twilight. Patches of moss glowed a faint, sickly green on the bark of the trees. I walked in silence, listening to the crunch of leaves under my boots, the rustling of unseen things in the undergrowth, the low whisper of wind through the dense canopy. For a while it was peaceful, a soothing kind of eerie. Then I noticed the quiet. The birds had stopped singing. The insects had fallen silent. It was like the forest was holding its breath. I pulled out the crumpled map. The circle now a stark, accusing black mark on the aged paper. A prickling sensation began at the back of my neck. I felt like I was being watched. The path I followed narrowed, twisting through the trees. I started seeing things out of the corner of my eye, fleeting glimpses of shadows moving between the trunks. I'd turn, heart pounding, and there would be nothing. It was always on the periphery, never fully formed, like a phantom memory. I tried to tell myself it was just the light playing tricks. The forest's games. The air grew colder. A different sort of cold, one that seeped into my bones. The scent of damp earth and decaying leaves was sharp, almost metallic, and that's when I saw it. Or rather, what was left of it, a pile of moss-covered logs, barely distinguishable from the forest floor. The lines were too straight, the shape too rectangular for it to be natural. This was it, the lost cabin, or what remained of it. It didn't look like a haven, but more like a place that had been simply forgotten. I moved around the perimeter, scanning the area. The trees here seemed taller, more imposing. The shadows were deeper, darker. The silence was near deafening. I kicked at the dirt, pushing aside the leaves. There was nothing, just bare earth, and the feeling of being utterly alone. Alone in a place that didn't feel like it wanted to be found. I told myself it wasn't paranormal or haunted. I just needed to go home and sleep it off. Walking back the way I came was harder. Much harder. The trail seemed longer. The trees denser. The unease I felt earlier was now a full-blown dread. The shadows seemed to move closer. The fleeting glimpses more prominent now, like something was following me. I started to quicken my pace, then jogged, finally running. I never looked behind me. I just wanted to get out. I practically stumbled onto the logging road, the open space a welcome relief. My breath was ragged, my body shaking. I climbed back into the Jeep, the engine sputtering to life. I didn't stop driving until I was back on the highway, the oppressive forest shrinking in my rearview mirror. I never went back to Oak Haven, but sometimes, late at night, I catch myself looking at the copy of that old map, the little circle with lost cabin drawing my gaze. And I swear, if I look long enough, I can almost see something moving in the shadows around it. Dory 20. The air was thick with the smell of pine and damp earth. Not an unpleasant smell, really, just heavy. It clung to my clothes, my hair. It's what I remember most distinctly about the first time I went to the old Kilbride farm. Not the grand sweeping fields I'd imagined, but this oppressive dampness. My uncle, Thomas, had left it to me after he passed. He never spoke much about the place, just mumbled a few things about keeping it in the family before drifting away. The drive there had been unnerving enough. The road narrowed, trees encroaching on either side, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. The sun barely pierced the canopy, casting the road in a perpetual twilight. By the time I reached the farm, the light was already fading. The house loomed, a dark, silent silhouette against the bruised purple of the evening sky. It wasn't the picturesque farmhouse I'd pictured. This was older, stone, weathered gray, with small, uninviting windows that looked more like vacant eyes. I parked the car, the gravel crunching loudly under the tires, a sound that seemed to shatter the stillness. I got out of the car slowly, the weight of the silence pressing down on me. The breeze, or what I thought was the breeze, seemed to whisper through the long, overgrown grass, like secrets being shared in hushed voices. Just the sound made me want to get back in the car and drive away. I walked up to the front door. The wood was rough and weathered, splinters digging into my fingertips as I turned the handle. It groaned open, releasing a smell that was even stronger than the outside. Damp earth mixed with something else, something acrid and musty. It made my nostrils burn. The inside felt colder than it should have. Shadows draped themselves across every surface. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light that slipped through the boarded-up windows. I remember the feeling that I wasn't supposed to be there. That the house was breathing, watching me as I moved between rooms. The main living room was sparse, almost bare. A few pieces of furniture sat under sheets, their shapes vague and ghostly. The grandfather clock stood in the corner, silent, but its presence felt heavy. I moved to the kitchen where the linoleum floor was cracked and peeling. The sink was stained with something I couldn't quite identify. I spent maybe an hour exploring the ground floor, my senses on high alert. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind against the eaves made me jump. It was an old place, sure, but it felt different. It felt watched. The stairs were old. Each step groaned as I placed my foot down. It felt like they were complaining under my weight, and they creaked with each step, a slow, rhythmic protest. The air on the upper floor was even colder and heavier, as if the cold was denser here, more oppressive. I didn't even touch the rooms, just peered into them. The bedrooms were bare, except for the odd forgotten object, a chipped mug, a child's wooden toy covered in dust. The way they were placed felt odd, like they had been abandoned mid-use. I returned downstairs, the floorboards still protesting and echoing through the house. The feeling of being watched had intensified, like unseen eyes were trained on my every move. I decided to check out the back of the house. I found a small, rickety shed, its door hanging unevenly on its hinges. It felt like a place that had seen its fair share of secrets. I didn't go in. I didn't want to see what was lurking in the shadows there. I stayed for what felt like an eternity, each second stretched out and heavy. The daylight was almost completely gone by now, and the house settled into an unsettling darkness. I remember looking at the windows, thinking they looked like dark, empty eyes, watching me, judging me. I decided to leave. Getting back into my car, I felt a rush of relief, starting the engine, and quickly reversing away from the house. I didn't look back, kept my eyes on the road ahead, not even glancing into my mirror. Just wanted to get away from Kilbride Farm. And that was that, or so I thought. I went about my daily life, trying to forget about the old farm, trying to push away the subtle feeling of dread that lingered. I tried to tell myself it was just an old house, and nothing more. Then a couple of weeks later it started. Driving home from work, I noticed a car behind me, the old beat-up pickup truck. I didn't think much of it. It kept a respectful distance, but over the next few days, I kept seeing it. Always the same style of pickup truck, always keeping a distance. When I parked at home, or parked while buying food at the store, the pickup would park close. It really started to unnerve me, making me wonder if someone was watching me. I felt the familiar feeling of the farm again, like I was being watched. I tried to tell myself that it was all my imagination, that it was my mind playing tricks on me, but I couldn't ignore the heavy feeling in my stomach. I decided to take a different way home from work one day, a longer way, but I thought it was better than seeing that truck again. I took the old road to Northwood, a country road that was longer than the usual route. The road curved through forests, the trees towering over the road, their branches meeting overhead, making the road feel like a dark tunnel. It felt like I was being swallowed. I felt like I was being pulled back to Kilbride Farm. I was driving along when I suddenly saw a figure dart across the road, a flash of movement in the dim light. It was too quick to make out any details, but it left a chill in its wake. It felt like the air had suddenly become colder. I slammed on the brakes, my heart racing in my chest, staring at where the figure was. The road was empty, not a soul in sight. But I felt that same feeling again, not watched, but almost expected, like the figure knew I was there. I continued driving. Just before I got onto the main road, I saw him. The man in the pickup truck. He was stopped at the side of the road, just sitting there looking at me. As I drove past, he didn't move, didn't look away. It was like he was just waiting for me. I took the main road and went straight home. and locked the door. I felt I had to be safe, but I knew the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. He was watching me. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to find out why this was happening. I knew in my heart that it had something to do with the old farm. It was like the farm's dark aura had followed me home. I had to go back. I had to see what was going on. It took a lot before I found the courage, but after several sleepless nights, I finally made my way to the farm. It was late, after midnight, when I arrived. The moon was a sliver of light in the sky, barely illuminating the house. I parked by the road, the sounds of the engine cutting in the silence. I got out of the car. I felt that same dread as I walked to the front door again. This time, I didn't hesitate. I pushed the door open, the hinges screaming in protest, and stepped into the darkness. The house felt colder, darker than I remembered. The shadows seemed alive, moving and shifting in the gloom, as if they were watching me. I walked with a purpose, going straight into the living room. My breath hitched in my throat as I saw that the sheet on one of the armchairs was on the floor, and a small wooden toy was sitting on the cushion. The toy. The same child's toy from the upstairs bedroom. It looked like it had been placed there. It felt like the house was trying to show me something. It was making me feel like I'm not alone, like I'm being watched. The silence of the house pressed down on me. I felt a sense of dread creeping into my heart. I felt like I was trespassing, like I'm in a place where I shouldn't be. I walked slowly into the kitchen, but nothing seemed out of place. I felt a surge of boldness and went up the stairs, each step creaking with my weight, the sounds echoing through the house. As I stepped onto the landing, I felt the darkness embrace me. It felt heavier than it did before. I heard a tiny whisper, just at the end of my awareness. I couldn't make out what it was, but it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I stepped towards one of the bedrooms, my hand shaking as I reached out to open the door. As I opened the door, I saw it. A small wooden child's toy sitting in the middle of the floor, like a small monument to some tragic event. The same doll from the living room, just slightly different. This one had an eye missing. It was watching me. It was watching me. I could feel it. I could feel the house watching me. The room grew colder, the air thick with a strange tension. I felt like I was not alone. I turned around to run, but I was too late. I heard the door slam shut, the sound echoing in the darkness. The shadows shifted and moved, surrounding me, and the last thing I saw were empty, dark eyes staring at me.